into an AI video maker. How the Titanic disaster unfolded. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the Titanic was crossing the North Atlantic at more than 20 knots. The night was unusually calm. There was almost no wind, very little moonlight, and the sea was remarkably flat. High above the deck, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee watched the darkness ahead. Then Fleet saw something. An iceberg. He immediately sounded the warning bell and contacted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship to turn. But the iceberg was already dangerously close. Titanic began turning, but the enormous ship could not change direction quickly enough. Its starboard side struck the iceberg. The impact was not a huge explosion. Instead, the iceberg scraped along the hull. But beneath the water, the damage was devastating. Water began flooding the ship, and within minutes, the crew began to realize something extraordinary. Titanic was going to sink. But the disaster had started long before that moment. To understand how Titanic sank, we need to go back to the beginning. In the early 20th century, ocean travel was transforming. Steamships carried millions of people between Europe and North America, and shipping companies competed to build larger, faster, and more luxurious vessels. The White Star Line took a different approach. Rather than focusing entirely on speed, it wanted to create enormous ships built around comfort and luxury. Titanic was one of 3 Olympic-class ships. Built in Belfast, it was approximately 882 feet long and was among the largest ships in the world. Inside were luxurious first-class rooms, restaurants, and public areas. But Titanic wasn't carrying only wealthy passengers. There were second-class travelers and hundreds of third-class passengers, many of whom were traveling to America to begin new lives. More than 2,200 people would ultimately be aboard. On April 10, 1912, Titanic left Southampton, England. The journey to New York had begun. The ship stopped at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Ireland before entering the Atlantic. For the passengers, everything seemed normal. They ate meals, walked the decks, talked with other passengers, and enjoyed the ship. But Titanic was entering an area where ice had been reported. On April 14th, several ships sent warnings about icebergs and sea ice. The Titanic received multiple messages. Some were passed to the bridge. The ship continued westward, and it continued at high speed. That night, the weather was clear and the sea was exceptionally calm. Normally, waves breaking against an iceberg create white foam, making the ice easier to see. But there were almost no waves. The iceberg would be difficult to spot. There was also little moonlight. The darkness ahead was almost complete. At around 11:30 p.m., most passengers had no idea what was happening. Many were asleep. Others were still enjoying the evening. The lookouts continued watching the ocean. Then, at approximately 11:40 p.m., Fleet spotted the iceberg. He sounded the warning bell 3 times. The bridge was alerted. Murdoch ordered Titanic to turn. The engines were also ordered to reverse. But the ship was moving too quickly and the iceberg was too close. Titanic turned. The bow passed the iceberg, but the starboard side scraped against the ice. The collision damaged several sections of the hull. Water began entering the ship. Captain Edward Smith was informed. Thomas Andrews, one of Titanic's designers, inspected the damage. The conclusion was devastating. The ship could not survive. Titanic was sinking. The next problem was getting everyone off the ship. Titanic carried more than 2,200 people. But there were only 20 lifeboats, with capacity for roughly 1,178 people. There simply weren't enough places for everyone. At the time, maritime regulations did not require Titanic to carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. Titanic technically met the regulations, but those regulations were inadequate. Orders were given to prepare the lifeboats. The wireless operators began sending distress signals, CQD, and later SOS. The Carpathia received the messages and turned toward Titanic at maximum speed. But it was roughly 58 miles away. It would take hours to arrive. The first lifeboat was launched at around 12:45 a.m., but it left with many empty seats. Other lifeboats followed. Some were also launched without being completely filled. Many passengers still didn't believe the ship was going to sink. Titanic was enormous. Its lights were still burning. It was still mostly level. For some people, climbing into a small lifeboat on a freezing ocean seemed more dangerous than remaining aboard. But the water continued rising. The bow began sinking lower. The situation was becoming impossible to hide. Passengers moved toward the boat decks. Women and children were generally given priority. Families were separated. Officers attempted to maintain order, but the clock was running out. Around 1 a.m., Titanic was clearly sinking. The wireless operators continued sending distress messages. The Carpathia was still racing toward the ship, but it was too far away to arrive in time. Another ship, the Californian, was also in the region. Its crew later reported seeing rockets in the distance. The circumstances surrounding Californian's response became one of the major questions after the disaster. But Titanic received no rescue before it sank. By 1:30 a.m., the bow was noticeably lower. The stern was beginning to rise. More lifeboats were launched. The remaining passengers realized that the situation was becoming desperate. At around 2 a.m., only a small number of lifeboats remained. Titanic was now dramatically tilted. The bow was disappearing beneath the water. The stern rose higher. The ship was under enormous structural stress. At approximately 2:17 a.m., the forward funnel collapsed. Soon afterward, the lights went out. Titanic broke apart. And at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the ship disappeared beneath the Atlantic. The Titanic was gone, but hundreds of people were still in the water. The North Atlantic was close to freezing. For those in the water, survival time was extremely limited. The lifeboats were scattered across the darkness. Survivors later recalled hearing people calling for help, but the lifeboats did not immediately return in large numbers. There was fear that they could be overwhelmed by people trying to climb aboard. For those in the water, their chances of survival rapidly disappeared. The lifeboats waited. They didn't know exactly when rescue would arrive, but the Carpathia was coming. The Carpathia's crew had pushed the ship as quickly as possible toward Titanic's last known position. At around 4 a.m., the first lifeboats were spotted. The rescue began. One by one, survivors were brought aboard Carpathia. People who had spent hours in freezing conditions were finally safe. By around 8:30 a.m., the last lifeboat had been picked up. Carpathia turned toward New York. Around 700 people had survived. More than 1,500 had died. News of the disaster shocked the world. Titanic had been presented as one of the greatest ships ever built. Now it was gone. And immediately, questions were asked. Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why was Titanic traveling so quickly through an area where ice had been reported? Could the iceberg have been spotted earlier? Why did some lifeboats leave with empty seats? Why did the evacuation take so long? Why did rescue take hours? Investigations began in Britain and the United States. Survivors and crew were questioned. Wireless messages were examined. Titanic's design was studied. The disaster exposed major weaknesses in maritime safety. After Titanic, the rules changed. Lifeboat requirements were strengthened. Ships were expected to maintain better radio watches. Ice monitoring became more organized. The International Ice Patrol was established to track icebergs and warn ships traveling through the North Atlantic. The disaster changed maritime safety forever. But Titanic wasn't destroyed by one mistake. It was a chain of events. Ice warnings. High speed. A perfectly calm night. Limited visibility. An iceberg spotted too late. A ship too large to turn quickly enough. Damage that flooded too many compartments. Not enough lifeboats. Confusion during the evacuation. And a rescue ship that was still hours away. Each event mattered. Together, they created one of history's most famous disasters. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck the iceberg. At approximately 2:20 a.m., it disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Less than 3 hours had transformed a routine voyage into a catastrophe. But the story didn't end when Titanic sank. Its consequences changed maritime safety for generations. The ship disappeared. The lessons did not. This was how the Titanic disaster unfolded.